A big day today when it comes to the issue of Indigenous Australians and disadvantage with the release of the annual Closing the Gap report. I'm joined from Canberra live by the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt. Thanks for joining me again, Ken. First up, I want to get your thoughts on this High Court decision that infers this new right not to be treated as an alien to non-citizens who have Aboriginal heritage. Are you concerned, as I am, that this conferring of a special right is only going to fuel the arguments that are already alive out there in the public domain against the voice and against constitutional recognition?
I think there's a couple of things in this, Chris. One is the way in which they applied the tripartite definition and reached a conclusion in respect to one individual but left the second individual open to further examination of their status. One of the challenges will always be, and this would apply to Australians born overseas and who come back here as well, they are entitled to certain rights as the children of Australians who've been born overseas. And we have many of those in terms of the diplomatic corps, but those who work. I think it's at the front end of a decision. The High Court was split 4-3, as we know. I'm reading through the judgment to gain a better understanding of the reasoning that the judges gave, including the dissenting judges.
But it's based, Minister, not on issues of citizenship, not on issues of ownership, but on issues of race. So it's quite a watershed in terms of our constitution and the way it's being interpreted.
Well, that's always been one of the functions of the High Court, is to listen to the evidence put by counsel to the High Court, and then for the High Court to consider that in respect to the Constitution and previous legal decisions that they have made. And I suspect that the discussions would have been very interesting given the 4-3 split, because they would have taken into account the Mabo previous decision, which identifies that connection between how they judged in relation to Mabo, but ultimately in their decision in this instance. Look, sometimes we have decisions that appear to be far more reaching, have a wider reach than in fact that they may be narrowed in scope depending on what else was in that judgment.
Yeah, I mean, there is a chance that this could be very narrow because on the face of it, it would affect very few people, but we'll have to see on that. What it does, though, in a broader context, is bring into focus, Minister, the idea of testing or proving somebody's Aboriginality. Now, this is going to be an issue when it comes to talking about a voice to Parliament. It's already an issue, of course, when it comes to native title. And it's been an issue in the public domain in the debate about people like Bruce Pascoe. How are we ever going to settle this?
Actually, not by a register. Generally, what we find right across this country is our people know who the Indigenous lines are. One practice we always do is we say to an individual, who's your family, meaning who's your mother's family. Then once you establish that, then you have the connection of the lines that are part of the kinship group. That's been standard. The other is the three-way test, and when you apply that, that's fairly consistent in all instances in which it's been applied. It's where it's not applied that you have that debate.
All right, well, we'll follow that issue up. I want to get back to Closing the Gap now, and the annual statement was delivered to Parliament today by the Prime Minister. Let's just have a look at one important comment in the statement from Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
Today I make the final report of an old approach, as well as the first report of a new era.
So that's the Prime Minister there talking about a new approach to this report. Now, especially as an Indigenous Australian, Ken Wyatt, you must be disappointed at the progress of successive governments in closing the gap, that is the disadvantage gap between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. In a nutshell, what is the new approach going to be?
It means achieving the outcomes against agreed targets that we are negotiating with the 47 peak Aboriginal organisations who have been sitting at the table working through each of the targets. There will be some directional shift, but I'll await the advice that comes back from them. But more importantly, we had a joint council meeting in Adelaide in which we, as the Commonwealth, the peak organisations and state and territory ministers spent a day discussing how we would address those targets, how we would address implementation and the way that we would work together in the future, including listening to voices at the local and regional levels and utilising state and territory advisory structures that ministers already have in place. So people will be sitting at the table and it'll no longer be an agency saying, this is the program we need, sign off on it, Minister, and announce it.
This is a threshold in the debate, a big issue in the debate that we're going to see unfold over the next year or two when it comes to constitutional recognition, when it comes to having an Indigenous voice to Parliament. People want to know, rightly know, how either or both of those reforms will and can lead to better education outcomes for Indigenous people, longer life expectancy, lower child mortality, higher employment rates. Is there a direct link between these reforms that are often seen as symbolic and those practical outcomes?
Well, I think the constitutional recognition is a higher level aspiration that fundamentally just goes to that notion, or the principle that Indigenous Australians were here first. 1788 arrived and we had a changed relationship and demographic. But the voice is important because that's going to give us the opportunity of listening through local and regional structures to what are the needs within specific areas of Australia. The report, when you read the Closing the Gap report, Julie and Lisa highlighted in the chamber this afternoon that there are parts of South Australia in rural and remote where the employment rates are higher than the national average. So we're taking aggregated data, but we should also be looking at areas, Chris, where the programs are exemplary and in fact go against the trend.
Spot on. Thanks for joining us, Minister. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.